When I do photo walks based on composition, one of the first questions I ask my participants is, what is photographic composition? And the answer that usually comes back is something along the lines of, well, it's the thing that makes our photographs look good. But what is that thing? And how can we as photographers harness it in order to take better photographs? In this latest episode of the Basics of Photography with Yorkshire Photo Walks, this is what we're going to be looking into. So join me as I delve into the beauty of photography composition. For me, composition in photography has three different purposes. Firstly, to provide height and depth to a photograph. Secondly, to organise the frame so everything within it works together. And thirdly, to guide the people that are looking at our photographs to the thing or things that we would like them to look at. In this video, I'm going to go into depth into each of these areas, looking at ways to help you improve your composition skills. At the end of the video, I'll also provide some examples to help you visually analyse your own photographic compositions. Let's start off by looking at height and depth. When you're out and about in the big wide world, chances are you'll be able to turn around 360 degrees and see everything that's around you. You'll also see it in 3 dimensions. However, when it comes to making a photograph, what we're having to do is condense that into a square or rectangular frame and also flatten it into a 2-dimensional photograph. That's why one of the main roles of composition is to reapply this illusion of height and depth, so we get the 3-dimensional effect on the 2-dimensional photograph. A few ways that we can apply depth to a photograph is looking for perspective points. So lines disappearing into the distance will help as they suck your eye through into the photograph so it looks like it's 3-dimensional. You can also use what I like to call visual stepping stones. This could be anything from actual stones in landscape photography to buildings going down a street in architectural photography. You can use whatever you want. Just make sure that in your photograph the eye is being pulled through the photograph into the distance. When it comes to height, one of the main points that I'll make is try to put your focal point above the horizon line. A horizon line in a photograph is the point at which one surface meets another. So in landscape photography, it's where the land meets the sky. In still life photography, it could be where your ground meets the background. So by placing your subject above the horizon line, not only does it help to isolate it often against a more simple background, it also provides an extra layer of height, making your focal point stand out and look more natural in the frame. That leads us nicely on to talking about composition as a way of putting together or organising our frame. To explain this, I usually like to use what I call my jigsaw puzzle analogy. Imagine you've got hundreds of jigsaw puzzle pieces in front of you, and it's your job to put them together to form a coherent image. Chances are you're going to get frustrated at some point and try and jam a piece in where it doesn't fit. But if you do that, it's not going to have a good effect on the end picture that you're trying to create. It's very much like this in photography. As I said earlier, we're dealing with this 360-degree view, and it's our job to take a piece of that and make it into a photograph. And not only do we just have to photograph that specific area, we've also got to organise the things within that area so that it provides that height and depth, but also helps people to see the things that we would like them to see. The most important aspect of any photograph is a focal point. Without a focal point, we just haven't got anything to latch onto, and soon we lose interest and it becomes just a boring flat photograph. The next thing that we've got to do is try and organise the rest of the frame around that focal point. Something that a lot of people fall back on at this point is something called the rule of thirds, which is where we split the photograph up into a 3x3 grid. It's said that by positioning a focal point on the grid lines, or at the points where the grid lines meet, it makes the photograph more aesthetically pleasing. This works some of the time, but it's important to realise that it doesn't work all of the time, so it's not something that you should use for every single photograph that you make. The way that I like to think of it is by imagining that central square in the 3x3 grid is a vortex, pulling people's attention through and into the photograph. It's been scientifically proven that the area that we look at more than any other within a photographic image is that middle area. So organising our composition around this point is absolutely vital. It's why we like looking at things like symmetrical subjects. By placing the centre of a symmetrical subject right on that middle area of the photograph, it looks so aesthetically pleasing because everything within the rest of the frame around that central point looks absolutely balanced. You might think then, well, why would we use the rule of thirds at all if we're placing something to the left or the right or above or below that central area? Surely if I place my focal point on that point all the time, then it would make my photographs more interesting. But that's not always the case, because some things that aren't symmetrical will start to look completely imbalanced and overcomplicated. The rule of thirds acts as a bit of a directional point towards the central area. So for example, if you're taking a portrait, make sure if you're placing the person on the left hand side that they're looking towards the right, so their eye line takes you into the photograph towards that central point rather than away and out of the frame. If you're photographing a flower, for example, maybe a bluebell, they always tend to droop to one side or another. So if a bluebell is drooping towards the left, place it on the right hand side so the way that it is drooping draws you towards that central point of the photograph. The main thing to remember when it comes to organising your photograph's frame is that everything should revolve around your focal point. At the end of the day, this is what you want people to look at, so therefore this is what should stand out in the photograph. So my advice would be, before you follow any random rules before really thinking about it, have a think about the size, shape and direction that your focal point is pointing in, and let these be the factors that help you make the decision on how you compose the photograph. Before I show you some visual examples of how good composition works really well, and sometimes how mistakes can make composition fall down, let's look at the final purpose of composition, which is how our viewer's eye is led to what it is that we want them to look at. When people look at photographs, they tend to be just inherently lazy, to put it bluntly. They need help in order to get to where we want them to get to. And there's multiple ways that we can do this. I suppose we've touched on it briefly by talking about how the centre of the frame is a bit of a vortex, and by organising our photographic composition around that central point, we can help our viewers to find what we want them to. Another way to do it is through a thing called leading lines. Now, a lot of people just tend to gloss over leading lines as, oh yeah, that's just a photographic composition technique. I'll shove in a line here, I'll shove in a line there, and everything will be fine. But there's a bit more to leading lines than first meets the eye. First of all, we've got to think about where they come from. Sometimes a line coming in from the side of the photograph can make us ignore the bottom third of the photograph. So one of the best tricks when it comes to leading lines is to have them coming out of the bottom corner diagonals. So by doing that, we cover every aspect of the shot. Another important thing to remember about leading lines is that they don't lead us out of the photograph. So lines positioned really far on the left or right, top or bottom, can lead our eyes straight out of a photograph rather than towards that really important central point. So make sure, if you are using a leading line, that it not only draws your eye to your subject, but it also pulls in the rest of the composition, so it ties everything again to that central point of the photograph. Another way to draw people's eye through a photograph is to use the visual stepping stones that I mentioned earlier. I'll use landscape photography as an example. So either rocks in the foreground that take you towards your focal point, it could be sheep or cows in a field, it could also be a series of fences that lead you on a journey through the photograph. But all of these things just give somebody's eye something to latch onto and take them towards what it is that you want them to look at. I hope that by going through those three purposes of composition, you've now got a greater understanding of what composition is, how it works, and how we can use certain techniques to improve the aesthetic value of our photographs. I also hope it's made you think a bit more about the focal point and its importance within a photograph, rather than blindly following a rule that might take you in the wrong direction. In this final part of the video, I'm going to show you some visual examples, some of really good composition, and others where the composition has just let the photograph down slightly. I think a really important skill to have is to be able to analyse what you see whilst you're out in the field and translate that into a good photograph. So hopefully what I'm going to show you now will help you to do that. This photograph on screen now could be said to have the perfect landscape composition. It's a classic example of the rule of thirds, with the style positioned on the right hand side and the classic combination of 2/3 ground and 1/3 sky. You've also got the road snaking away on the left hand side, leading your eye through the rest of the landscape, and those visual stepping stones that we talked about earlier in the form of the trees. The other thing that stands out about this photograph for me is the way that the style breaks the horizon line. The two prongs stick proud of the line of the hills in the background and are emphasised against the clear blue sky. This photograph, you could also say, is decently composed. You've got the diagonal lines of the walls leading in from the side, leading you towards that central point. That line's also emphasised by the path running straight through the middle of the photograph. The tree in the midground also gives a nice arched control to the photograph, leading your eye again around that central point. The shadow also making that curve continue throughout the whole of the photograph. The only thing that jars about this shot for me is the tree in the very background. Because the leaves are of similar tone and colour to the tree in the midground, because, as I said earlier on, when we make a photograph we're flattening it into a two-dimensional image, it brings the perspective down quite dramatically. So I think this photograph would be much stronger if that tree wasn't there. The advice that I would give this photographer is maybe trying to photograph this shot from the opposite direction. The walls, the path and the tree would still act as lines, but you might find that there's a simple background looking in the opposite way. This photograph is a good example of how two subjects can work quite well in the same photograph. Again, they're placed on the thirds at either side of the photograph, and because they're both leaning towards that central point, it emphasises the middle point of the composition and shows off both of the subjects individually. The depth of field also helps here, making the plant on the left a bit stronger than the bridge on the right, but the bridge, because it is such a domineering subject, also adds to the complexity but yet simplicity of the composition. Because once again both subjects are proud of the horizon line, it cuts them out and makes them stand out above the busyness of the grasses in the foreground below. This is another photograph that is a classic example of the rule of thirds in landscape photography, but for me it's where the rule of thirds starts to fall down. If we look to the tree on the left-hand third, you can see that it's leaning to the left, so our eye is automatically going to follow the way that that tree is leaning. Because it's positioned on the left, all of our attention is going down the left-hand side of the photograph, which leaves the less interesting, barren landscape on the right superfluous to requirement. On the other hand, this photograph works so much better. Because the tree is placed centrally and we've got all the lines of the limestone pavement leading towards it, and the rest of the landscape around the tree is so simple, it really makes the focal point of this photograph, i.e. the tree, stand out, much more than it would do if it was positioned on either of the thirds. To finish off with, I'm going to show you two examples of this final photograph, of how positioning your focal point within a photograph really makes a difference to how the photograph looks. This is the original photograph that I took. You can see that the line is running through the diagonal as it goes through the burst of the leaf, and all of the points of the leaf are pointing out towards the edges of the frame. I've positioned it slightly to the right-hand side, so those lines always go through that middle point and give your eye room to look and then come back to the focal point instead of leaving from the outside of the frame. In contrast, this is the same photograph but positioned in the central aspect of the frame. Again, we said earlier on that our eyes are automatically going to be drawn to that point. But because, as I said earlier on, that the leaves protrude out towards that left-hand side, it makes the photograph just look slightly imbalanced. The black area at the top right of the photograph starts to draw your eye more, because instead of being nicely balanced with the lines leading you towards the central aspect of the frame, they're now leading you out of the frame, leaving your eyes lost for what to look for. People say you either have an eye for composition or you don't. Although I believe that some people probably do see compositions quicker and maybe a bit easier than others, I don't think it excuses any of us not to pay a bit more attention to how we see the world around us and translate it into the photographs that we make. Next time you're out, pay close attention to how our photographs revolve around that central vortex of the photograph. Choose your focal point carefully and make this the grounding for all the decisions that you make on composition. If you tie all this together with height and depth and lines to help lead your viewer's eye, I can guarantee that you'll start seeing improvements in your composition skills.